Helen Alvare is a professor of law at George Mason University School of Law, where she teaches family law, law and religion, and property law. She publishes on matters concerning marriage, parenting, non-marital households, abortion, and the First Amendment religion clauses. She is faculty advisor to the law school's Civil Rights Law Journal, chair of the Task Force on Conscience Protection of the Witherspoon Institute in Princeton, New Jersey, president of the Chiaroscuro Institute in New York, and chair of the Catholic Women's Forum, a consultor for the Pontifical Council of the Laity in Vatican City, an advisor to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops in Washington, D.C., and an ABC News consultant. She cooperates with the Permanent Observer Mission of the Holy See at the United Nations as a speaker and a delegate to various United Nations conferences concerning women and the family. In addition to her publication in law reviews and other academic journals, Professor Alvare publishes regularly at the publicdiscourse.com and in news outlets including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Huffington Post, the Weekly Standard, and the Washington Examiner. She also speaks at academic and professional conferences in the United States, Europe, Latin America, and Australia. Prior to joining the faculty at George Mason University, Professor Alvare taught at the Columbus School of Law at the Catholic University of America, represented the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops before legislative bodies, academic audiences, and the media, and was a litigation attorney for the Philadelphia law firm of Stradley, Ronan, Stevens, and Young. Professor Alvare received her law degree from Cornell University School of Law and her master's degree in systematic theology from Catholic University of America. We are honored that she would come to BYU to speak to us on such an important topic, and I have had the opportunity of spending some time with her and hearing her in other forums, and we are in for a real treat and a great privilege. Professor Alvare.
I am so much infinitely shorter than you are. Thank you so much for giving up some of your evening time for a lecture. I know it's kind of a rough time of the day. I'll try and keep it interesting enough till you stay awake till the Q&A when you wake yourself up again and stand up and ask questions. I can't thank Richard enough, and Emily, and the Wheatley Center, and I'm honored that the president of the university is here, and honored that Lynn Wardle is here. I have worked with Lynn over the years, and he is one of the greats, and just such a champion, such a contributor. He keeps the ideas flowing in the midst of a very difficult environment for family law professors here. I also have the privilege of working for Cole Durham. I said working for him, didn't I? Yes. When Cole says, we need you in, and then names 3 cities, one does have that feeling that one is working not just with Cole, but for Cole. So I owe a lot to this university, and I'm very grateful to be here. I realized that it was almost 3 years ago that I was supposed to come here and got caught in a snowstorm. And I'd like to think that God had some other interesting plans, in addition to the fact that that snowstorm, which was indeed a snowmageddon in D.C., took down the biggest tree in my backyard, took off, which was on our bedroom. So it took down the roof, the siding, the windows, the gutters, etc. Just enough of everything to have it reconstructed. The night I came home from that, it was 8 hours to get home from an airport 9 miles from my house because we got stuck in the snow so many times. And the man who's been driving me round trip to airports for 21 years asked me to wait with this couple who was very elderly and was coming back from a trip while he came to get us both at the airport. We were all stranded and couldn't get out. And then we traveled 8 hours together in a car to get back. And they were Christian, fearful, secular atheists in a very outspoken manner. And I remember thinking, is this what God had in mind by stranding me here in this car for 8 hours and not being able to get to blessed Utah? So I don't know. I hope I left a favorable impression on that couple. I think I did. At least she knows that not all Catholics hate modern art, which she thinks is sort of some kind of God. And so I was sort of in her good book. So that was my last time to be here. But now I'm here today, finally, after a couple of years, to give a title that has things in it to please and things in it to displease the world at large, right? In the world we live in today, the phrase equal partners will probably satisfy a lot of people. Particularly people who like the word partners, not spouses, or people who don't like the words marriage and family, they might like that. But then they would really, really be upset with the next part of the talk that uses the word roles in marriage and family. All three of those words are really getting a run for their money right now. In the work I do at the United Nations in particular, you would never see the words marriage and family. It's as if they don't exist in documents about what? Women, children, and families. They don't exist. But you'll notice that the word roles really does play a central role in this title. So, what can I offer you tonight that is going to bridge the two parts of that title, equal partners and the salience of roles? What can I offer you is considering, especially nowadays, the dangers when you enter this topic of reductionism, subjectivism, stereotype, the dangers of slighting historical periods or regions of the globe, all of which are inherent in any attempt to actually speak about women's or men's natures or roles. Not to mention the explicit rejection, post-Simone de Beauvoir and others, of the very notion that there is such a thing as the essence or nature or role of a woman. No, everything is socially constructed. And anything that you would say about a woman in particular, she said, are just conclusions that flow from patriarchal control of all society and of every relevant academic discipline. So, it's true, we have to acknowledge, that many role assignments to men and women ended up inuring to the detriment of women, right? You'll see when we look at them together. Now, on their face, many of these role assignments are not just objectively placing women in the lesser position, but society accounted these roles as lesser. Why? Well, maybe because women were doing them, and it was a male-led society in many, many cases throughout history. Maybe because men had led the way, shaping the mindsets in which traits were evaluated. Or maybe because the human race is prone to agreeing to value power and material possessions, or commercial or political or economic life, and very tangible accomplishments in those arenas over accomplishments in personal or familial arenas. In any event, what I've decided to begin this talk with is relying on this marvelous, it's not a 3-volume series yet, it will be soon, Prudence Allen, who's done The Concept of Women in Philosophy from the beginning of philosophy to the present, takes the notions about women and men through history to today. And I was just visiting her in Denver last week, and her 3rd volume is coming out. Her final volume, Bringing Concepts of Women Up to the Current Time, is due out next year. And so I got some of the chapters in advance. And so if you look at this material about concepts of women and men throughout history, you'll see that, again, while not objectively on their face would the women's traits be ranked lesser, they often have been. So I'm going to start with women's traits first. That'll be the first one I mention, and the male trait on the second side. So women would be body, male mind. Women body, male rational faculties. Women matter, male spirit. And then let me keep going without the headlines each time. Domestic or private sphere, public sphere. Practical, intellectual. Intuitive for women, rational for men. Concrete, abstract. Detail-oriented, big picture. Local, national. Linear thinking, complex thinking. Follower, leader. Passive, active. Dependent, independent. Receiver, giver. Invisible influencer, visible influencer. Gentle, rough, weak, strong. nonviolent, violent, calming, provoking. And here's an interesting set. Virtue, vice, or vice, virtue. It really depends on the era. Those switch a lot. Tempter, tempted, tempted, tempter. Those also have switched through history. Back to women and men. Innocent, worldly. Relational, individualistic. Communitarian, individualistic. Collaborative, hierarchical. Scattered, focused. Okay, so those are some of the leading dichotomies, if you will, through history. Now, it's by no means sure that the assignment of these dichotomies will not shift or even reverse, or that their rankings, which usually were that the male trait was in some sense objectively superior, but we don't know that these rankings will remain stable in the future. Societies, economies, practices change, and what are now called female traits, traits particularly like collaboration or relationality, are actually getting their due. They're being seen as valuable in and of themselves and to the society, in part through the work of some of the feminists of the late 20th century. Still, I'll argue in this presentation that while it remains fraught to speak of dichotomies, roles, differences, and natures, it remains rational and even helpful to do so, but in a new framework. This framework that I'm going to be describing, a way to speak of these that I think provides a foundation also for speaking equally of roles and equal partnerships between men and women, is a framework that I have derived from the theology that I follow in Catholic teaching. It's called the Anthropology of Women, or the Anthropology of the Dignity of Women, or the Anthropology of Sexual Difference. And a lot of it has echoes or analogies or common references to the Family Proclamation of the Latter-day Saints, and I will point them out from time to time. So I'm going to turn first to the question of why we can still even speak of the salience of roles of men and women. And then I'm going to talk about how, in particular, a Catholic anthropology of roles, or male and female, puts them in a new framework that allows us to speak of equal partnerships in the same way that the Family Proclamation would speak of them in many points. So, why we can still speak of the salience of roles. The modern iteration of the sexual revolution, right, has been unfolding for at least 50 years, although I know historians would easily take that back to the 1920s and have a lot of good reasons for doing so. But what we're very familiar with is in the past 50 years. During these 50 years, women, frankly, whose yes to the dissociation of sex from babies and marriage has been the outstanding feature of this revolution. Women have voted with their feet in a way that still allows us to have a presentation titled as this one is. So, yes, women have voted with their feet in ways involving assuming roles which in some cases overlap quite neatly with those populated previously almost exclusively by men, in the functions they've assumed in particular. But they have also voted with their feet, in many cases, to choose X but not Y, in a way that indicates that the phrase, the salience of roles, is neither offensive nor inaccurate. There's evidence, in other words, of persisting differences between the lives that women and men choose, even though virtually every choice is now open to women. Women still prefer some jobs over others, as do men. Women still profess a higher interest in getting married than men do, and earlier too. Women express preferences for fewer sexual partners in their lifetime. They express more regret and actually experience more depression over sexual encounters that occur outside the context of commitment. Women want children more often than do men, and they often are the ones more often that initiate that conversation. And by a whopping 85% to 15%, female to male, it is women who dominate lone parent households. I mean, that figure worldwide is over 90%. I mean, what an indication that you can't speak of just cultural conditioning when you have a 9-to-1 ratio, right? Women also more often express a preference for flexible or part-time work schedules in order to spend more time with their children and with elderly family members for whom they care. There's also the fact, in terms of my theme here, which is the appropriateness of speaking about the salience of roles. The fact that the most famous scientific, and I use that in scare quotes, gambits for the proposition that there are no important differences between men and women have really been exposed as failures or lies or worse. Sister Prudence Allen also covers this matter, again, in the book chapters that are not out yet, but she does an awesome job on it, and so I owe a lot to her for my coverage of this material. She details how the research upon which the most strident claims of the 20th century were made for the claim that there's no difference between men and women. These strident claims have some common problems, okay? She identifies the most common problems as the following. They were often based upon research that wasn't just using flawed methods, but really outright fraudulent methods. They used research that harmed the innocent, and the consequences of their research also harmed the innocent. They tried to argue from animal behaviors to human behaviors. And they also tried to argue from the exception to the rule. I'm going to go through a tiny bit of that with you. It is a criminally brief summary of Michel Foucault, Dr. John Money, and Alfred Kinsey, just to raise up these themes. These are the people to whom we owe the modern assumption, right, that there really aren't any important differences between men and women. I mean, the feminist literature picked it up, but these were the theorists that launched the giant books that became the New York Times bestsellers and landed them on the cover of Time magazine that really put this information into the culture. So, regarding Dr. John Money, for example, you may recall he was the leading claimant for the notion that sexual identity is completely socially constructed. And any child could be successfully reared, if done so from birth, as a male or a female. He claimed to prove this with his most famous experiment, if you recall, the Reimer twins, one of whose penis was accidentally severed during a circumcision at his birth. That boy was chosen by his parents after consultation with Dr. Money to be reared as a girl, and he underwent some surgery and including hormone injections. He was also introduced to excruciatingly and pornographically explicit instructions about how to behave like a girl sexually from an early age. He was told nothing of his male origins until he was a seriously depressed, confused, and suicidal teenager. At that time, when he was finally revealed his identity, he chose instantly to live as a male, took the name David, later killed himself, and his twin brother died of an overdose of the medicine he was taking to die for his schizophrenia. Dr. Money continued to claim consistently that that experiment was a success and proved his point. Prudence Allen points out that Dr. Money's work was also characterized by comparing humans to animals, exposing children to pornography, promoting pedophilia as natural, apparently with regard to incest and pedophilia, research that he was goaded on to, in particular by Margaret Mead. He also claimed that research involving hermaphrodites or animals was equally applicable to sexually normal men or women, and he made other clear abuses of the scientific method and of human beings. French philosopher Michel Foucault, he argued for the dissociation of the body and the soul or the mind, right? And for the replacement of male and female sex identity with sexual experience and sexual pleasure. He eventually acknowledged the influence on his research of his attraction and his living the sadomasochistic lifestyle of the San Francisco bathhouses of the 1970s, and eventually knowingly participated in that in AIDS and wrote a bit about how he was seeking his own death through sex, but claimed that this experience was illuminating for his ability to pronounce a normal, standard, every person's male and female sexual identity, which he claimed did not exist. Dr. Alfred Kinsey of the famous Kinsey Report, in the process of coming to his conclusions and recommendations for pansexuality, employed testing involving adults sexually arousing children ages 0 to 8, pressuring research subjects to admit that they had engaged in sexual behaviors, homosexual and heterosexual, when they had not. Dr. Paul McHugh, who some of you may know, who's head of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins for decades, the researcher who eventually put a stop to Dr. Money's transgender surgery there, After a systematic study of gender identity and those who had, and there were many gender identity changes in that clinic, concluded, quote, sexual identity is mostly built into our constitution by the genes we inherit and the embryogenesis we undergo in the womb. Okay? So, and that evidence is not critiqued on the basis of its scientific validity in the processes used or the persons involved. But even knowing today what we know about these claimed scientific findings of no essential differences, we have to acknowledge that there still is a great resistance to acknowledging differences between men and women. And we have to sympathize somewhat with those who are afraid to acknowledge those differences. Because it is true that various cultures or governments or even religions have relied on these differences as reasons to treat women with less than equal dignity. But we cannot let these fears of what might happen with these dichotomies be the last word. We have to concern ourselves first with what is true, not only because it's important to acknowledge what is true about the human person, but also because refusing to acknowledge differences between the two sexes has played an important role in instigating real social harm. And I mean, I'll just give a couple of examples. And I had to shorten this part of my reflections. I wrote a lot more, but I had to cut them back for time. But people who claim that there's no difference between male and female have argued for the latter part of the 20th century, for instance, that it makes no difference in married life if the man and the woman switch roles, or if they have an agreement between them to observe a rigid 50-50 division of everything that people do in a marriage. Every kind of childcare, every kind of housekeeping, every kind of chore. And yet we find in very recent research in this arena that couples who live this way actually have the highest risk for divorce. And that people in particular who live with a marital philosophy of measurement or confounding their own inclinations toward their vocations in marriage, as opposed to a marital culture of abundance or giving. I have gifts to give, you have gifts to give. That actually the people who switch roles or keep accounts have the least successful marriages, not the most successful. By refusing to acknowledge this difference between men and women, we have a refusal, by definition, to consider even the possibility of complementarity. And we insist that everything that a male and a female do in the context of a family is an overlap of what the other does. That somehow either or both sexes is absolutely redundant. And there's nothing that either could receive from the other. And of course this has also led in a variety of academic disciplines, sociology, psychology, etc., anthropology, to a real lack of studying of the phenomenon of complementarity. It turns out that one and one make more than two outside of simply the function of procreation. That there are other things that couples do together that actually are more than the sum of their parts, that are in addition to just having the children in the first place. There are things that children benefit from, even if a second person, one male and another male, try to do exactly the same things. We can't even put our finger on it yet because we haven't even had a sufficient interest in studying it. And this is a great failure that flows from the insistence that because there's no differences between men and women, there by definition is no such thing as complementarity. And of course, if you don't value differences between men and women, then that naturally leads to not valuing children. If any two people can be in a relationship, and that is equally valuable to a male and a female relationship, then children are nothing really special. Then the fact that children, their existence and society itself, flows from the differences between the man and the woman is of no moment. Okay? And then finally, of course, a difficulty that has emerged from the insistence there's no difference between male and women is sexual dysphoria, right? Inviting people to live as if any sexual practice, whether transient homosexual or transient heterosexual practice or a homosexual practice, any of these, aside from the pleasure they may take from it, is irrelevant to their mental or spiritual health. It's irrelevant. Sex is not related to the person, right? The fact that you were born a man or a woman is irrelevant to the meaning of your life or to your vocation. And so whatever you do sexually, it has no meaning. It's just a physical thing that you do. But since children aren't important and the relationship between men and women are important, then sex is just an individual expression of myself carried into the world. It's not anything to do with the relationship, let alone making new life. Okay? And this too flows from this insistence that there's no difference between men and women, that we are infinitely sexually malleable, and our body has no relation to our mind or our soul. Of course, this is the argument that led naturally to same-sex marriage. So in other words, the fear of what might happen, that some people might take these dichotomies if we acknowledge them and rank them, cannot be the last word, cannot hold us back from thinking about the fact that there are differences between men and women. It is a fact in the world. You do not have to be theologically inclined to acknowledge it and to wonder, what is this about? What is this for? What is it good for? Okay? But this leaves us with the question of what to do with the bad stuff, the use of these dichotomies to demean women. So what I would like to do is share with you how, in particular, John Paul II, but also Pope Benedict, approached this question. The most definitive place that he did it was probably a reflection on women called Mulieris Dignitatem, which means on the dignity of women. That was put out in 1988 by John Paul II. Okay? So I'm going to talk to you a little bit now about what Mulieris Dignitatem did with regard to women. Okay? Did I say 82? I meant 88. Sorry. Mulieris Dignitatem, it did refuse to accept these historically received dichotomies on their face with their greater and lesser rankings. Okay? And in that sense, it had something in common with the secular feminisms of the time. Now, of course, one might think that its refusal to just accept these on their face would endear Mulieris Dignitatem to a wide swath of feminists, but then we would all be naive. Anything coming from the lips of the Catholic Church would not likely be endeared to a wide swath of feminists. Some, but not a wide group. For by the time Mulieris Dignitatem appeared, while later 20th century feminisms had taken a variety of approaches, right, to smashing these old dichotomies, the majority of its leading forms expressed hostility, or at best indifference, toward any reflection on women, which would link women with care for the human person as a special gift or calling. Consequently, no matter that Mulieris Dignitatem insisted upon women's dignity or their radical equality with men and affirmed a feminine genius, right? That was its money line, the feminine genius. Its conclusions involving God's entrusting the human person to women in a particular way simply were not embraced by the feminist establishment, either in privileged countries or at international institutions like the UN with such outsized influence in developing countries. So let me tell you a few things about how Mulieris Dignitatem did not do what the secular feminists did, but did something new all the same and got rid of the unsavory parts of the old rankings of dichotomies. Okay? First, what it did. Mulieris Dignitatem, and of course John Paul II's Theology of the Body series, innovated the understanding of the meaning of being created in the image and likeness of God. Okay, this is something our religions share. Your Family Proclamation is clear that all human beings are in the image and likeness of God. Right away, a basis for a kind of equality that it's hard for anything else in the world to match. People can talk in the world about why they think men and women are equal, but it's really unbeatable when you say we're equal because we were each equally created in the image and likeness of God, okay? Previously, however, when the image and likeness of God was spoken of in theological and even in sort of secular circles, what does it mean? It was human beings' free will and our capacity for rational reflection that were the nearly universally and solely celebrated aspects of our image in God. This state of affairs on its face had a way of advantaging men, given that the field of opportunity for men to publicly exercise these faculties, their free will to make something happen in public, and their rational faculties, was vastly greater than the field open to women by law and by cultural practice. But mulieris dignitatem and the theology of the body highlighted something new. It said human beings image God importantly in a new way that is every bit as important as free will and rationality. It is that we were made in and for relationship, in the sense that men and women together image God, not one to the exclusion or without the other. In Genesis, therefore, we find the observation that before the creation of the woman, the man's solitude was not good, which is kind of shocking. God makes something and then looks at it and goes, "Nah, that's not good." I mean, that's really a mind-blowing little piece of scripture there. In both the Old and the New Testaments, God is described with both paternal and maternal traits. Theologian Margaret McCarthy, she studied under Angela Scola, a brilliant theologian in Italy, has a wonderful analysis of the relational aspect of Imago Dei. She analogizes this relationship to men and women to that between Jesus and his Father, about which it is said, and tell me if you have not also been stumped by this passage of Scripture, Jesus, quote, did not deem equality with the Father something to be grasped at. How? I mean, that's a stunning piece of scripture. I always thought, what could that mean? Just as how could it be that women are equal to men without grasping, right? Margaret McCarthy interprets this to indicate that the question of men's and women's equality must also be answered like Jesus with his Father in a relational context, to wit, the Father is a father by virtue of having a son, and the Son a son by virtue of having a father. Applying this analysis to men and women, each is the only one fit to be of mutual help to the other, in ontological and other senses. Each is the only one who can make the other a parent, with, as Genesis says, the help of the Lord. Each needs the other to understand more about the very identity and image of God. Okay? So, once this human imaging of a Trinitarian God as relational is brought to the fore, then not only are men and women essential partners, essential, you can't do without either of them in imaging God, but the woman's capacity to bear new life and her special gift of attention, what Benedict used to call her capacity for the other, can be identified and valorized. The old dichotomy's instinct to rank traits is just transcended in favor of seeing them always in light of one another, in the matter of interacting mutual gifts, which is very much my understanding of the way the Family Proclamation talks about the gifts of the husband and the wife as in equal partnership, but definitely different, not less than one another, but each in light of the other, right? Interacting mutual gifts. Closely related to this first aspect of mulieris dignitatem is a second. While mulieris dignitatem eschews rankings of gifts or traits, it easily affirms the differences between the sexes. This transcends the inclination of history to rank and of secular feminisms to avoid acknowledging differences because of the belief that they can only lead to rankings. Mulieris dignitatem accomplishes this by framing all differences as gifts received in order to be given. You're given a gift. Why? In order to give it. And there's a theologian, Brian Johnstone. You probably don't know him. I think he's a diocesan priest. He was at Catholic U when I was there. Now he's back in Australia. And I'm not sure if he even ever published the paper. I got it in advance. But he talked about a new framework for understanding Catholic morality in light of this anthropology was all behavior, has to be judged in terms of whether it capacitates the other to be a gift. Another way of saying, are you acting in accord with who the other actually is? And to love is to capacitate who they were meant to be by God. It's a wonderful paper, and I can't find it in print. I just have the little typed version. Third, mulieris dignitatem boldly asserts that love is the meaning of life, and women are first or prior in the order of love, the first to be entrusted with new life. I have to say, when I read this, it was just a little bit before my daughter was born, and I was annoyed because I thought to myself, is this letting my husband off the hook? Where are we going with this? I'm first, but I'm like being put up first to be alone with this? No. This isn't where he was going at all, it turns out, okay? It bases its conclusions not only on the fact of women's fertility, but also women's demonstrated gift for acknowledging the other. The recognition of women's gift for loving other persons means, John Paul II claims, here's where it gets interesting, that she teaches the man his fatherhood, teaches not to lord it over him, but to enable him to give the gifts men give to their wives and to their children and to the world. Emily, this recalls the conversation we were having about baptism this morning, right? And it is impossible to gainsay that given the woman's experience of pregnancy and childbirth and this thing that comes out of you when you're way home with the hospital with the child and you look at it and all of a sudden you have this thought that if anyone gets near them, you're going to kill them. And you think, oh, I wonder where that came from. You know, sort of like, it's the first time in your life you thought, oh my God, if someone extended a finger near this child. And you thought, I've never had that thought before. And your husband is coming to understand. You hand him the child. It's this back and forth, but there is no doubt that your understanding of pregnancy and giving birth and motherhood is a different thing. And I know this is still a neuralgic part of Mulieris Dignitatem, but again, remember what I said, teaches not to lord it over him, but enable him to learn the gifts men give to their wives and to children and the world. And I'll just interpose here for a moment that I'm really hopeful at some point that the Holy See will put out a document. They've done one on the collaboration of men and women, but I'd like to see a new one on that also. But one on the genius of men, right? And because I need them to explain, how it is that husbands gift their wives with things like how to get by on a faculty of, 31 men and 4 women, or how to have a sense of humor about certain things that you never thought you could laugh at. I mean, what is that? What do we call that? We know what we call the women's gift for coming into a room and making sure that everybody's okay and that everybody has someone to talk to. And that I remember my daughter having a party when she was about 8, and she invited girls she didn't like. And I said, why? And she said, because everybody needs a group of 3 to talk to, and there are some girls here that don't have that third party, and that's their third friend. And then we're thinking, wow, this is clearly something that is coming from the female, aspect of this child. Anyway, this feature of Mulieris Dignitatem, it's claimed that women are gifted with a capacity for the person. But its simultaneous insistence that love is the meaning of every human life upends the entire historical inclination to account feminine traits as lesser, both because they're feminine and because such a ranking assumes that worldly goods and power are the measure of success rather than the capacity to love well. If that's the measure of success, then this discussion of who the woman is and what her primary gift is has a whole new aspect. Fourth, Mulieris Dignitatem redeems the body while not exalting it as higher than the spirit of soul. Previously, because the body's mortality and its other limitations, right, and failings were noted, women's association with bringing forth new life and caring for persons was accounted against them. Oh, you're the one who are interested in taking care of the body, which is a passing phenomenon, right? From these premises flow what we still see today, women's bodies treated as things, as property, right? Thus prostitution, thus pornography, thus trafficking, thus demands that sex is the price of a romantic relationship or cohabitation. But Mulieris Dignitatem brings the body into the economy of salvation, teaching that it images a God-in relationship, that it points toward the goal and the good of the male-female union. It points toward the social context of every human life. Their bodies are obviously built not to be alone. Right? They are built for relationship. It points toward God's procreative activity. So Mulieris Dignitatem does not agree or disagree with the old characterization of women's association with the body, but it reinterprets the meaning of all human bodies, and therefore both women's and men's experience of them. It says they are indications that you are made for the other, first for your spouse and your children, and then for everybody. Fifth and finally, about Mulieris Dignitatem, it identifies men's tendency to dominate women as men's original sin in relation to women, versus what many had believed that my church taught, that male domination was the natural law, the natural order. John Paul II has even asserted that because the world valorizes domination as a promising trait, right, as a sign of success, and a winning personality, that men's original sin is actually harder to overcome than women's because they get rewarded for it. He identifies, by the way, in case you're curious, women's original sin as possessiveness of those given to them and the willingness to try or being willing to establish a relationship with a man on a basis less than equality and mutual gift. Mulieris Dignitatum's meditations on original sin have the effect of a tunnel dug underneath the entire edifice composed of the historical rankings of claimed differences between men and women. They indicate that such a building should never have been built in the first place and suggest an alternative blueprint for a good building. Acknowledge sexual differences, yes, but for the purpose of mutual gift-giving between men and women, and between each of them and their neighbors in the world, both in thanksgiving for the first gift giver, who is Christ, and in reverence to him, mutually. It likewise acknowledges that male-female relations are extremely fraught with original sin. It's a first place of operation. Okay? So, I'm going to make 6 points in conclusion or reflection on what I see here in light of the signs of the times. I hope I've established that some very powerful images of women's roles or traits have persisted in history, some to the present day. And I've stated that these were received quite differently by John Paul II in particular, and by various feminist thinkers operating outside a Christian framework. I would also say the Family Proclamation receives these differences, the question of differences differently, and interprets them in light of the common good, in light of it being possible to speak of the good of a unit, not just of the individual, and different contributions to that unit as meaningful and necessary. I would now like to conclude with thoughts about where we might go from here, particularly on the matter of women's roles in light of the signs of the times, because I think women are the most fraught about the future. Now, I agree, men are also fraught about where they're going to go in an economy with declining jobs that seem suited precisely to their past expertise, or in an economy where you have less men graduating both from college and grad school on a national level. But I think because it was women who bought the separation of sex from marriage and babies and really brought us the sexual revolution as we have it, that it was their buy-in to that stupid idea that brought us in many senses to the place we are today. How might we make our way out of this situation? In 6 points. First, I think the word roles may be irreversibly tainted in the modern world. I do. I just think it's a tainted word. I think it might be more useful to speak of women's and men's gifts or capacities or contributions or fields of action, not only in relation to those as individual possessions, but also in relation to our God-given vocations and what we can bring to everybody who we are vocationally called to serve with those gifts. Second, I think any reflection about the future of women needs to be framed, almost in every case, in the context of the gifts that men and women bring to one another. There is a burgeoning literature on women alone, but the world is obviously changing for men, revealing difficulties for them not only in the labor market, but also really in the marriage markets. I mean, not among people who are educated, but among lesser educated, men without a degree, without income, without proper or stable jobs, are simply not being chosen in marriage. And they are going through a series of transient relationships and cohabitation, but non-marriage. One would not wish to see a movement in reaction to men's situation that made the same mistake as several feminisms. That is, failing to think of men and women as necessary collaborators versus combatants. In the same vein, society has paid some but far too little expert attention to the question of the complementarity of men and women everywhere. We are together in every arena. We have talked some, although not enough, and there's certainly not enough data on what it is that we bring complementarily in the family. But what does it mean that there are women and men on my law faculty? What does it mean that women and men are doing every kind of job together? What gift are we missing by what it is that they're doing together? Third, I hold that the secular feminist response to women's historical inequality deny, deny, deny all differences, say everybody is the same, deny complementarity, more and more, deny that marriage is anything to do with happiness or freedom of women, that children have anything to do with this. I think this secular feminist response is hurting poor and vulnerable and minority populations and children the most. And I think the religions like ours, which have a deep grasp of the family, have a lot of work to do, not only among our own, but out in society, to overcome this. The message that it is good to reject stable relationships with men, reject marriage, to normalize non-marital childbearing, all of these, which are staples of a secular feminist response to the past, are among the leading causes of poverty, sexually transmitted infections, even, interestingly, if you've seen the data, a shorter lifespan for poor women, violence against women, child suffering, and intergenerational downward mobility. No policy regarding poverty can hope to succeed without attending to this. And this has become clear over the last several decades' natural experiment. This is all the more galling because, of course, people who do have money and who have gone to college or grad school refuse to preach what they themselves practice. They marry before they have children. They stay married. They make sure their children get through school. But they refuse to propose this for the poorest, for whom they still announce that the only rule is there are no rules, right? That sexual expressionism rules the day, that you need to do what you really think is necessary to form your own identity and your own understanding of the universe. I don't know if anybody here remembers, it was one of the most famous editorials ever printed in the Wall Street Journal. They said they never got more, and this is saying something for the journal, they never got more letters in response than they did to this one. And it was an editorial called No Guidelines. Does anybody remember it? It was after the Oklahoma City bombing, and there was also a killing at an abortion clinic near in that time. And what it said was, okay, all you elite Americans who tell those who are poor or who don't have good advice from their families about how to negotiate their sexual lives or their educational lives, and when you tell them that the only rule is there's no rules, and then they follow your lead, and they don't have the margins of money or family or educational or cultural institutions to tell them otherwise and remind them that that's an interesting thing to study at school, but it's no way to live your life. Don't be surprised when they bomb buildings and shoot abortionists, because that's what you're going to get when you tell people the only rule is there's no rules. The response to that was so amazing. One woman said she crumbled up the editorial, she put it in her mouth and vomited it up and then mailed it back to them. I think we've hit a nerve there. I think we've hit a nerve. But it's the case that for themselves, in the words of Charles Murray in his book Coming Apart, elites live sound family lives for the most part, but refuse to preach what they themselves practice, and preach instead a message, a cheap gospel, if you will, that everything is fine if you choose it because I don't want to condemn you. And you end up with familial chaos that also ends up being an inescapable correlate of poverty, violence, etc. Fourth, women have got to be particularly active participants in the movement for religious freedom around the world. You may have noticed that the movement to crush religious freedom in some parts of the world is being waged precisely in the name of vindicating women's rights. You see this at the United Nations. You see it in the regional bodies, Latin America, Africa. You certainly see it at the European Court of Human Rights. We're seeing it here in the United States with the HHS contraceptive mandate, that if you really care about women, if you care about women's human rights, you have to silence religion. You see the same argument is being made in the same-sex marriage debate. If you care about human rights, you have to silence religion. But the argument about particularly religions paying for contraception or abortifacients or sterilization, and in a blink it will be religions paying for abortion, is waged in the name of women's rights. Women have got to be particularly vocal about the right of religious freedom because they are speaking for us when they are crushing it. But there's another delicate matter here. In less privileged nations, women have to participate in the complex task of both promoting religious freedom while simultaneously opposing tendencies that come from some religious voices to obscure or deny their God-given dignity or to claim that they are second-rate. In these latter situations, there's important work to be done in assisting some authorities in these countries to understand that they can embrace authentically pro-women reforms without swallowing all of this horrid women's platform that comes from the West that says abortion and contraception and avoiding marriage and childbearing are the keys to women's freedom. They're afraid to accept the good parts of a women's rights agenda because they think this is necessarily comes along with it. This is delicate work, but it has to be done while promoting religious freedom. Fifth, we've had a more or less natural experiment over the last several decades, allowing us to observe what happens when a substantial number of women actually can choose how they'd like to spend their whole lives. Preliminary results are in. Women actually still want to marry and have marital children. Women are happy to exercise their talents outside the home as well. When they are mothers, however, the majority of women, shocking to the pundits here, prefer to work part-time or on and off in cycles responsive to their children's needs, although there are always women who wish to work full-time as well as those who simply have to. Our government has asked women and children and families, however, to make the greatest sacrifices if they wish to have children, rather than enabling women and men and families to put their families first. Government policy, and I actually wrote on this in a piece that Lynn is published in the International Journal that you started. Governments have emphasized as their, quote, family policy, women's freedom not to have children. That's the policy. Contraception and abortion. We don't really have a family policy, right, in our law at all. I think I called that article Curbing Their Enthusiasm, the federal law and the unitary family. And the answer is there is no federal law on the unitary family. It's all about just saying, wiping the slate clean of the obligation of children and saying, okay, now do what you want. We're not going to help you as a family. We're actually not going to help you as an individual woman either. We just wanted to make sure you didn't have to have kids. And then we assumed that you would bootstrap it like the males. Okay? 6, women seem naturally... the response to that, of course, is that we have to mention that this is what they've done. They have had no family policy and bought a lot of... I can't believe how many women's votes they've bought on the cheap. And governmental and self-described women's groups really need to be called to account for this. The opportunity costs of their priorities are not only family fragility, but also the dearth of policies which actually value the caretaking work of full-time or part-time mothers at home, and which actually take care of the family as a unit or of women as caretakers. 6, and finally, women seem very much in a position to be excellent communicators of what I'm talking about here, all these messages that I'm putting forward. They do not have to adopt male ways of doing things. It's interesting. Pope Francis says, when I speak about a new theology of women, I'm not talking about machismo, okay? And John Paul II wrote in Evangelium Vitae, I'm not talking simply about adopting patterns of domination, okay? But I'm talking about a new way for women to reject their old approach to smashing the dichotomies and rankings that characterized parts of the oppression of women, a new way for women to take this up. Women need seriously to communicate that the old way has to be held to account. It hasn't only immiserated women, but particularly poor and vulnerable women. Women are in a privileged position to say that progress and freedom and dignity are achieved when persons and institutions operate according to the rule of losing oneself in the service of God and one another. Women are brilliantly placed to communicate not just the power of the gospel, but the power of this truth, which everybody knows by the time they die, right? That human beings are not made to live as individuals. They are made for the law of love, which is a cycle of entrustment and fidelity. And only in living that will they actually have a career that was actually an accomplishment or a family that was actually an accomplishment. An important caveat here. A lot of theologians have written about an opposing phenomenon. That is, that the struggle for the cause of the human being is waged first via attacks upon the woman. As I said, it was an attack upon women's natural desire to hold sex and marriage and childbearing together, that gave us really the sexual revolution we have. It was an attack precisely upon that instinct of women. This is the underside of the woman's role as the one to whom the human being is first entrusted. Around the world today, it is the woman who is urged, often by self-proclaimed women's groups, to abort her child. It's the woman who's urged to distrust men as a general hermeneutic. It is the woman who initiates divorce proceedings in the United States in 66% of all marriages, and in the majority of marriages not marked by violence. It is the woman who is assured that non-marital childbearing is morally neutral, and that labor market accomplishments are far more valuable than anything she could be doing with the family. In short, it is the woman who is targeted to deny the fundamental truth that human life is fundamentally about relationship, not autonomy. A terrible irony when you consider that it is probably the woman who is entrusted first with the opposite message. This is not an absolution of men. As John Paul II and others have emphasized, men are regularly the invisible participants in women's sins. But it is an identification of areas where women could be exhorted to lead the way out of the crisis that we're in with regard to relationships between men and women, and with regard to the family, and with regard to marriage. Women could lead the way toward prioritizing again the demands of love. Empirical data on this are tantalizing. They indicate that if women understood their power in the marketplace of relationships, you can tell I come from a law and econ faculty, can't you? If they understood their power in this marketplace, and they acted in concert, if they knew that they held the power of the seller, and acted by making demands not only of men, but also of employers when it came time to marry and have a family, of the government with respect to family, they would not only serve their own interests, but also the interest of the neediest, including in particular children and poor women, and they would vindicate the cause of the human being to a great degree. It is not weakness. It is not just bowing to the demands or the fiats of religion for women to do this, but cooperation with the internal logic, the natural law of the law of freedom, which we all come to find out at the end of any length of life is coextensive with the law of love. Women have, at this moment in time, I think, the power in particular to bring this message to the fore, and because they have the power, they have the duty to do so. Thank you very much.
My name is Hannah Wheelwright. Thank you so much for coming. I was very intrigued by some of the themes in your lecture, in particular your description of Moliere's statements that the original sin of men is domination over women. And it seems to be a significant theme in your lecture is that we need to, I believe you said, valorize feminine characteristics and simply elevate women to the status of men. And I was especially intrigued at your frequent references to the Family Proclamation, in particular because the Family Proclamation also states that fathers are to preside over their family. And so I was intrigued by this idea of presiding and your defense of complementarianism. And so I was wondering if you could clarify, do you believe that men presiding over women is truly compatible with complementarianism? If so, how? And if not, what can we do to address that issue in addition to valorizing feminine characteristics?
Right. I would have to say I am woefully ignorant of the theology of the language of presiding, right? And I don't understand what that might mean in the context of the male-female relationship or with respect to the family as a whole. We don't use that language in Christian theology. We talk about, and in fact, this is part of what I've said, is we really need more. And the collaboration of men and women was a good beginning, but we need something much larger and more detailed in this. We have this discussion about what women bring to the table, but we don't really have enough yet. And I understand it, because this was written in the 80s, and the conversation was about what does the church have to say about women on the theory that they had oppressed women for so long. Do you really have a theory, a teaching that is other than what we think it is? So we don't use the language of presiding, and I don't know the theological background of that. Seriously? There has to be literature, I would imagine, on this. And I'm sure that It may interact with some of your, I'm not going to use the word sacraments, ordinances with regard to baptism or confirmation and the roles that different people play there. It may interact with prayer practices. I'm not sure how it interacts with the kinds of things that people do in a household, like whether it impacts particular family chores or things like that. I can't say I know the answer to that. All I know is that the part in the Family Proclamation that talks, yours speaks about women's nurturing of children, ours speaks about the capacity for the other, the acknowledging of the person, the first understanding that the other is here and requires an extraordinary amount of care, and he's dependent and interdependent. But we do not have parallel language yet on what we would call the male genius is. So it's not parallel, but there are echoes here and there, particularly with regard to the acknowledging of differences and the woman's, just her particular capacity with respect to children. But more than that, I'd be really interested in exploring more of the literature on presiding to find out more. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask, if you were to say what adjectives you would use to describe the characteristics of women that are inherent to them and the characteristics of men, as opposed to the ones that you listed at the beginning that are the traditional characteristics.
Right. I have not done that in writing. I think most of what I would offer would probably flow out of this notion of the entrustment language of mulieris dignitatem. I think, interestingly, even when various theologians in my tradition have been offered to do this, they will refer at that point to several things: pregnancy, childbearing, dividing up the work in the household. They will also refer to the long-term choices that a woman would make about how to spend her time and her money. But most of these flow from, it's not about men valuing other persons, it's how they value them and how they choose to express it. And so I would value and show my respect and value for a child by doing certain things. It would involve the food for the boys in particular. It would involve, whereas my husband feels that it's really important, for instance, to do things that wouldn't have occurred to me as a first thing. And so I can't, I'm not a family systems theorist. I don't put words to those different responses. They're both forms of love for the other person. And I would just sort of be rambling up here if I tried to go further on that. I do know what I had, I kind of put in this summary. It was a very short paragraph at the beginning, that women actually choose to spend their lives more with vulnerable people who are interdependent with them than they make choices to spend their lives earning or at a workplace. They just do, even when those choices are present to them. I'm not trying to say my experience is typical, but I remember even when my husband had a terrible layoff, and we were just in very on the edge financial condition. My job was stable, and I was offered a job making 4 times my salary, which would have taken care of all our problems and then some. And I said to him, listen, it's a great job, but I really don't like not being here after school every day, and I don't actually want it, but do you want me to take it? And you'd really have to stay home for a couple of years. And he said, well, I don't really want to do that. Whereas if I had been made that offer, I would have wanted to do that. So if you look at the long-run data, most women, with all the opportunity in the world to have particular jobs and particular positions of corporate or other leadership, they are choosing unto today still to either put it off a bit, cycle it a bit, manage it in some way that they are able to put the people in their lives who need them first. And that always is going to involve a sacrifice of time and money on the other side, and often prestige. Maybe not forever, but they're willing to take that risk. And that's actually how they would like to live. And we now have decades of that data. And unless one has the response that this is all socially constructed, that women are doing this strictly in response to a role that is institutionalized, that they are reaching for, because that's society's way of saying whether they're good or not. Unless you believe that, then there's something about that data that says that whatever other minor traits we want to talk about in women, and I'm so reluctant to get into details because men and women share so much, but her desire to spend her life in a different balance between taking care of those interdependent and others is just a huge feature that I think other things flow from. And that's about where, as an ignorant lawyer, I could go.
First off, thank you for coming. I thought your speech was brilliant. My question is, you talked about how when we fail to recognize the difference between the sexes, we start to devalue the idea of children. And I wondered if you could speak more specifically about the connection between those two.
Right. Obviously, it's so obvious that society forgets it. It's always been that one of the grand things about the male-female relationship is its potential for forming a family and having children. And even if you just stepped back and you were pretty clinical about it, it would be because they form existence itself, and we would be sorry to see that go away. I mean, I don't know how many of you read P.D. James's Children of Men, but it talks about a society where there are no more children being born and everybody loses interest in sex. It's fascinating. It's a really interesting reflection. The idea that men and women are all that the only thing that's important about them has nothing to do with what they do together. That what's important are these other things that have taken the place of family in our lives. Materialism, individual personal goals. Materialism is a big one, and individualism, I'd say, are two of the biggest. And those things become what everybody is about. And they aren't for anything. They're the end for every person. If what men and women do together, even in terms of sexual intimacy, is the same on both sides, it's just an act of sexual expression, and there's no important difference between them, then there's nothing significant about who the woman is or her vocation in the fact that she carries the child, or that she feeds the child, or that, again, globally, and now, even over decades, when she could do anything she wanted, she chooses to spend so much of her time in the care of the child. They're just naturally intertwined. If you take differences away, then sex is tennis. Children are just another thing in the world that we may wish to have. But they are not some magnificent product of our differences. I mean, think about how unbelievable the human being is as a creation, right? I mean, the guy who invented IVF said he went into a lab to find out whether God was in control, and he came out saying he was in control. But I don't think he could possibly believe that, nor can anyone else. The lack of awe over the making of a human person, that's just, I don't know how God gets over that kind of anger, that we're not still impressed by this, right? And impressed by something that this is what men and women do together. It's a roundabout reflections more than a straight answer, but there it is.
You mentioned that women often leave the workforce and leave public positions for positions within their families if they have the option. And I think as we cultivate this kind of feeling of raising up feminine values in society, it's going to become more common. How do we
What's going
prevent
to become more common?
women leaving public positions for family
Okay.
reasons? So how can we prevent men from dominating the cultural and institutional paradigms
Mhm.
about the value of male and female characteristics?
Right. This is a big question that Pope Francis wants to take up in the Catholic Church, too. Every time he says we need a new ideology of the female, one of the next sentences out of his mouth is, in the church. So I don't think this is too mysterious. I think women cycle in and out, or they work flexible hours. Or, I think that's sort of the model we're going to see in the future. And I think in a way, it replicates what we had in the past, where the husband and wife worked together on the farm, right? It's just a new field for action. Sometimes my husband and I laugh because I'll be home writing, and while he's a lobbyist, he does a lot of his preparatory work at home, and then he goes down to the Hill. And sometimes we're both up at 4:30 because we have some kind of deadline, and he'll say, just another morning on the farm. And it reminds me that we're doing all of this work at home, right, together. We see our children off to school together. One of us is always there, mostly me, when they come home from school. But we found a way that we can work from home. And we can work less at some periods of our life, or not at all, and more in others. I have to say, I would be very loath to see any arena you can think of without feminine values in it. I was asked, the Washington Post did an interview about, Pope Francis wants to see women in dialogue with bishops and cardinals and popes about the world and everything the church does in it. And they said to me, where do you think this is going? Is this fruitful? And I had the opportunity is an awful word for it. I had the awful job that I accepted of overseeing the investigation of clerical sex abuse in the Diocese of Philadelphia. I interviewed the victims. I read the priest files. I went through all of the canonical and criminal laws to try and harmonize them, and the vocation intake and the vocation review and the seminary procedures. And I was asked by the press to summarize my thoughts, and I said, they really underappreciated the horror of reports about this. And I said, just off the cuff, I said, I don't think a mother would have made that mistake. I don't. Wouldn't have made the mistake of understanding the horror of sexual abuse of a child. And there are many times where I've been, and I have been privileged in my life to work with so many different people in so many different areas of the church. And clearly, sometimes the woman's understanding of a situation, family, society, etc., is missing. So I think the answer is not a retreat from these arenas. And Pope Benedict, in the collaboration of men and women, explicitly called for women in every arena, right? But I think it is a situation where we can put our families first, and where that may mean a living wage for the father, in some cases, a fully living wage. It may mean a willingness on the part of governments or employers to allow women to work in flexible or cycled times, none of which we are seeing very much of at this time. And a lot of that is because the opportunity cost of being so loud and so long about abortion is, the uber feminist issue. It sucked all the oxygen out of the room. All those decades went by, and we got none of what I'm talking about, because some women's groups claimed that what we really needed was just a field wiped clean of children, and then everything would be okay. Then it's a level playing field. So that would be, I think, how I would see it in the future. Thank you.
You spoke a lot about, or you mentioned, I should say, about the concept of tainted language in our discourse. And a lot has been done about that tainted language in behalf of women, and not relegating them to certain areas of our society. And so my question is, how would you like to approach the concept of discussing the capacity and gifts that men have, without the negative aspects of those things.
Right.
You know, if you look, there are men, despite what the impressions that are given by our media and our society, there are men that do want to step up to the plate and do want to have families and do want to do right by those families.
Mm-hmm.
But when certain words are put into the playing field, they're seen as demeaning toward women.
Right.
And I definitely would agree with you that the way that we approach this is by elevating both sexes, not by relegating one until they're equal.
Right.
No leveling sameness there. So how would you approach the language to where men are able to apply their gifts and capacities without being demeaning toward women?
Right. I think there's an awful lot of, the expression gender mistrust, I think, is in the literature out there. And there's, all kinds of blogs and internet sites where men and women rant at each other. And I can't even tell you the names of some of those sites because they're not polite at all. And there's a couple of things I would do to move toward this. One is I would start talking about how men and women have voted with their feet over the last 50 years and the roles they've assumed, and say, this isn't name-calling, this is just saying what's happened. This is identifying the roles they've stepped into. And I think I agree with you, it's a landmine. I even meet some really, really well-intentioned 20-something women in particular, right, 29, and they really wish they were married. And they say, oh my gosh, men just won't step up to the plate. And they say it many, many times. And I'll just give you an anecdote that kind of captures what I think these women are doing and how I think we might help them get off of this. So I know someone who met this guy out to dinner with friends, and he started bragging about something he could afford. And she thought he was a really nice guy, and then a few minutes later she thought to herself, what a braggart. He's boasting. He's so full of himself and what he can afford. And I think he was talking about a car he was going to buy or something. And she was telling the story to my husband and I. And my husband says to me, he was really just trying to impress her, that he had a good job and that he could afford things. He said, my husband knew the guy, he's a nice guy. But I think he was trying to say, look, I've accomplished something. Look at me. And she wouldn't respond to his invitation for, can I call you sometime, whatever, because she thought this one remark put him off the list. I think we are not having a conversation at all about the way that we misinterpret. We are name-calling one another across the divide, but we're not having a conversation at all about what women admire about men and what men admire about women, as opposed to what they're not doing for us when we make demands of them. People don't like it when you make demands of them first thing out of the box. They like it when you invite them to share who you are with them, and vice versa. I've helped start a website, I Believe in Love, where particularly those in lower middle income can celebrate men, women, what it is they do together, and particularly the good that they can all benefit from by linking sex and marriage and childbearing. And it's meant as a service for people to have, for young men and women to have this conversation. Why this group? Because this is a group most right now suffering just tumbling rates of marriage and high rates of cohabitation and non-marital childbearing, which are very hard on them economically, spiritually, emotionally, and for their children. So I think it's up to people your age to make a public conversation out of this, to reflect on the things in your relatively short life, are gifts that you've received coming from women, reflecting on beautiful things that you've seen, and women vice versa with men, And I think we would see a pattern emerging of the things that we like about one another. I mean, you never meet a woman my age, I don't think, who's been married a while, who doesn't thank God for the gift of her husband's crazy sense of humor, or just ability to see tragedy through, you know, some weird, dark sense of humor that comes welling up from beneath. When they thought they diagnosed my third child as being very, very sick, and maybe dying upon birth, and suggested an abortion. My husband let out a guffaw, he burst out laughing in the ultrasound. This was one of these high-powered ultrasounds, and he whispers in and he says to me, "Do these people not know who you are? Do they not know that you are already writing the Type A mother's guide to raising the disabled child?" Every woman who knows men for a while or who has raised sons can tell you what they love about men. I just think it needs to get out there more. But it needs to be said by the people who are in the gender wars right now, right? And so I've just, answered one of the questions that you raised before. What's one of the great things about men? Well, they don't seem to take offense easily, and they seem to be able to, get back up and swallow some enormous, even maybe this was case of a desperate situation of a child that might not live, and come back with yeah, I'll show you, and I've got a sense of humor about it. There's a certain kind of strength in that. So I think this website is an attempt to get that conversation going among people who really need to have it desperately. Maybe people in your educated demographic very much need to have this conversation as well. I think we really desperately need to have this conversation around what's happened in the sex mating and marriage markets. I wish women would say, I really don't like this, and a whole bunch of us are walking off the set. We're going on strike. Mark Regnaris, who's the main researcher on this in sociology, says women need to form a whoopee cartel, I think is the quote in the New York Post or the New York Daily News. And men need to be told, this isn't good for you either, even though you're the buyers in this marketplace. That honest conversation can't come just from older people like me and experts in sociology and anthropology. It needs to be had by groups of people in your demographic who can know how to speak to one another. I think that would be key. Maybe you ought to found a blog that does that. So I guess I'll stop there. Thank you very much.